It was a typical sunny afternoon when things took a turn that no one, especially not Karen from the HOA, could have predicted. I was on my own property, doing some light landscaping near the edge of the woods behind my home. A few flower beds, maybe a fire pit installation, nothing out of the ordinary. Birds were chirping, wind was light, everything about the day felt calm. That is, until I noticed the unmistakable glare from across the street. Karen, arms crossed, mouth tight, that classic disapproving posture. Anyone who's ever dealt with a self-righteous HOA board member knows the type. Clipboard under one arm, phone in the other, pacing like she was on patrol in a war zone. I paid her no mind. Why should I? I wasn't doing anything wrong. I wasn't building without permits or disturbing any neighbors. I was literally placing stones on a garden trail. But Karen clearly had other ideas. She shouted something, but I couldn't hear it over the hum of the tools. I gave a polite nod, smiled, and went back to my work. Then I noticed her phone suddenly go to her ear. She started pacing faster, voice raised, and then I caught the words, "Yes, officer, there's someone illegally altering the community property." I froze. Community property? She was talking about my land. 10 minutes later, the sirens came. Not fast and urgent like a life was in danger, but slow and deliberate, like the officers were trying not to laugh. 2 police cruisers pulled up right to the edge of the cul-de-sac. Karen practically ran to them, flailing her arms, pointing at me like I had just robbed the neighborhood bank. I couldn't hear every word, but I could catch the tone. He's not allowed to build anything there. It's against HOA regulations. That land is under our jurisdiction. I stood there waiting, wiping dirt off my hands, wondering how this absurd situation had escalated so quickly. One of the officers approached, hand resting lightly near his belt, the way they do when they're unsure if someone is a threat or just a confused homeowner. He asked for my ID, politely, and I handed it over without fuss. Then he asked if I knew that what I was doing might be against HOA rules. I raised an eyebrow and calmly responded, "I'm pretty sure HOA rules don't apply to privately owned land that's not within their official boundaries." He looked puzzled. Karen stormed forward again, waving a crumpled HOA handbook like it was the Constitution. "It's in here. He's violating Article 7, Section 4. No unauthorized landscaping on communal grounds," she shouted. I could see the officer's expression shift from concern to mild irritation. I asked if I could show them something, and I went inside to grab the deed to my property. Not just the house, but the parcel of land that extended well beyond where Karen assumed the HOA lines ended. I laid out the documentation right there on the hood of the cruiser. Parcel maps, ownership history, boundary lines, everything legally registered with the county. The officer called in the property ID, and after a few radio exchanges, nodded quietly. He turned back to Karen and gave her the look. "You know the one. The kind where someone realizes they've made a fool of themselves, not just in front of neighbors, but in front of the law." Karen wasn't having it. She doubled down, insisting that community aesthetics had to be preserved, that unauthorized changes threatened home values, and that she had the authority to call in complaints against violators. She even threatened to report the officer for negligence if he didn't do something about it. At that moment, the second officer, who had been mostly silent, stepped in and asked Karen whether she had ever reviewed the HOA's actual jurisdiction map. Of course, she hadn't. She relied on assumptions, gossip, and her own sense of self-importance. While they calmly explained to her that not only was I within my legal rights, but that she had falsely reported a non-emergency situation to 911, I simply stood back and watched the scene unfold. A few neighbors had come out by now, some pretending to check their mail, others openly filming with their phones. Karen's face turned redder by the second, and her voice lost its volume. She tried to walk away, but the officer asked her to stay for a written statement. She paused, glanced at the gathering crowd, and slowly realized that this little power move of hers had backfired spectacularly. I didn't have to raise my voice, threaten legal action, or call anyone higher up. All I had to do was wait and let the truth come out in plain daylight, in front of everyone she had hoped to impress. Karen wasn't just your average nosy neighbor. She was the self-declared queen of the HOA, the type who patrolled the neighborhood like it was her own personal fiefdom. From the moment she got a seat on the board, things started to change. Rules became stricter, fines got steeper, and suddenly, small things like slightly off-shade garden gnomes or leaving your trash bin out a little too long were considered major violations. It was no longer about community upkeep. It was about control. And Karen thrived on that control. Her favorite pastime seemed to be sending warning letters, snapping photos from behind bushes, and lecturing neighbors about the sanctity of HOA order. At first, I tried to stay neutral. I paid my dues on time, followed the basics, and kept to myself. But as time went on, the HOA, under Karen's lead, grew more aggressive. Notices began appearing on doors for things no one had ever complained about before. One neighbor got cited for having wind chimes that disturbed the tranquility. Another received a warning for a lawn chair left out overnight. Karen even filed a formal complaint about kids riding scooters on the sidewalks, calling it a safety hazard. She treated the HOA handbook like scripture, except she conveniently interpreted it however suited her. Then came the harassment tactics. Not just against me, but the entire street felt it. It wasn't just about enforcing rules anymore. It was about demonstrating who held power. One day, I received a notice saying that the trees on the edge of my property were a visual obstruction to community harmony and needed trimming, despite the fact that they had been there for years and were well within code. I asked for clarification and got a vague, copied section from the HOA rules. I requested a meeting with the board and was told it wasn't necessary. Karen, of course, was acting on behalf of the community. She started sending letters weekly. Then came surprise inspections. I'd come home to find Karen standing on the sidewalk, clipboard in hand, jotting things down as she squinted at my flower beds. One time, she even walked halfway up my driveway, claiming she was checking setbacks. It didn't stop there. I caught her photographing my back porch from the walking trail behind my fence. I asked her directly what she was doing, and she simply replied, "Ensuring compliance." It wasn't just irritating, it was invasive. Neighbors began whispering. Some admired her thoroughness, but most were exhausted. Still, few wanted to speak up publicly. They feared retaliation, and for good reason. One resident who questioned a board decision was suddenly slapped with multiple citations within a week. Another tried to run for a board seat and had their application mysteriously misfiled. Karen had created an atmosphere of quiet fear. She wielded her role like a weapon, and the HOA was her battlefield. I started documenting everything. Every notice, every photo, every encounter. I realized I wasn't the only one being targeted, but Karen was escalating things with me faster than anyone else. That's because I had begun making subtle changes to the land near the HOA boundary, a section she believed she controlled. She couldn't stand the idea that someone might be outside her reach. That's when she ramped things up. Anonymous complaints began showing up. One accused me of running a business from home. Another said my fence height was illegal. All were baseless, all dismissed, but they kept coming. And that's what led to the police call. Karen was convinced that if the HOA couldn't stop me, the authorities could. It wasn't about legality. It was about intimidation. She wanted to make an example of me. Her mission was to show the rest of the neighborhood that no one was beyond her oversight. She assumed that a police presence would embarrass me, shut me down, and send a clear message. What she didn't count on was the truth about the land, the paperwork I held, and the calm way I would respond. Even after the police incident, she tried to regain footing. She called an emergency board meeting to discuss boundary violations. She sent a formal letter accusing me of disrupting neighborhood integrity. But each time she pushed, she found herself on shakier legal ground. The HOA's authority had limits, and she had crossed them repeatedly. Her belief in her own power was so inflated, she failed to see how vulnerable it all really was when tested against actual facts, documents, and due process. For years, there had been confusion over where the HOA's property ended and mine began. It didn't bother me much at first because I wasn't doing anything controversial. My cabin sat quietly near the edge of a wooded lot, and the property had been in my family for a long time. The landlines weren't something most people paid attention to until Karen took over the HOA. Once she stepped into power, Suddenly, every inch of earth was questioned. She began asserting control over areas that no previous board had ever bothered with, claiming they fell under shared responsibility. That's when I decided it was time to pull out the paperwork and get everything sorted, once and for all. I went down to the county office and got full, certified copies of my land deed, parcel boundaries, zoning documents, and ownership history. What I found confirmed what I already knew but had never needed to prove. The land in question, including the disputed trail, green space, and even part of what Karen called community garden space, was entirely mine. It wasn't part of any HOA purchase, nor had the HOA ever held rights to manage or maintain it. My land extended farther than most people realized, a leftover from how the lots were originally divided decades ago. The surveyor's maps were crystal clear. They showed my lot spanning across what the HOA had mistaken for common area. It even included a few feet into the walking trail where Karen claimed the HOA had beautification rights. I double-checked everything, consulted with a real estate attorney, and confirmed there were no easements or shared usage clauses buried in the fine print. This wasn't a gray area. It was private land. No association rules applied there. What surprised me more was how long the HOA had operated under false assumptions. Nobody before Karen had ever tried to regulate that area. In fact, older board documents listed it as unclaimed perimeter buffer in early meetings. There was no recorded vote or acquisition. Just Karen's word and her misinterpretation of a vague map. The attorney even laughed at how poorly the HOA had documented its boundaries. Their maps were outdated, their internal property lines were hand-marked copies, and their digital records had been lost in a system migration, as one clerk put it. Still, knowing the truth and proving it to Karen were two different challenges. She wasn't the kind of person who would back down when presented with facts. To her, authority came from assertion. She ruled by volume and confidence, not by accuracy. So, I prepared my response meticulously. I printed large maps, highlighted my land in clear boundary lines, and even brought old title transfers from previous owners showing consistent legal ownership. I made copies for the police, for the board, and for Karen herself. When the police arrived after her 911 call and I handed over the documents, their tone changed immediately. They were respectful, professional, and most importantly, thorough. The officer radioed in the parcel number and confirmed everything I had shown. There was no HOA jurisdiction on that land. No shared control. No rule enforcement. Karen was stunned, visibly shaken. She had walked into this confrontation with certainty and ended up face-to-face with hard evidence she couldn't dispute. In the following days, word spread. A few of the other board members quietly reached out to me, apologizing for the confusion and asking if they could review the documents themselves. I welcomed them over, showed them the files, and explained the situation calmly. They weren't as arrogant as Karen. They seemed genuinely surprised at how wrong the assumptions had been. Some even admitted that Karen had been pushing boundaries, literally and figuratively, for some time, and this might finally expose the extent of her overreach. What was most revealing was Karen's silence after the incident. No more citations showed up. No more sudden inspections or vague notices. For someone who loved to lecture and write strongly worded emails, she had suddenly gone quiet. The truth had taken the wind out of her sails. Her power, built on shaky interpretations and self-confidence, had been undone by one thing she couldn't argue with: the law. The boundaries she tried to enforce weren't hers to control. The land she believed was within her dominion never had been. Everything she had done, from calling the police to issuing citations, had rested on the idea that the HOA had control. Once that illusion was shattered, so was her leverage. And while I never intended to wage a war against the HOA, I had reached my limit. This wasn't about rebellion or defiance. It was about standing my ground, literally, against a system that had stopped serving the community and started serving one person's ego. As the police pulled up that day, their cruiser rolled to a slow stop at the curb in front of my property. The lights weren't flashing, but the presence was enough to draw attention. A few neighbors peeked through their curtains, and some came out pretending to check their mail, all watching to see what the commotion was about. Karen had already rushed over to them, gesturing wildly and holding her phone like she was still mid 9/11 call. Her voice was loud, theatrical, as if she were narrating a crime scene. She pointed at me and my tools at the portion of land I was landscaping and insisted that I was violating HOA rules and damaging community land. The officers stepped out calmly, one walking toward Karen and the other approaching me. I stood near the flower bed, gloves still on, trying not to smirk at how absurd the situation had become. The officer asked me for ID and what I was doing, and I explained politely that I was improving my own property, something I was fully allowed to do. I told him I had the deed and all documentation ready if he needed to see it. He nodded, professional and neutral, then walked over to confer with his partner, who was now trying to parse Karen's tirade. Karen was still adamant. She claimed I was destroying HOA-managed space and insisted that I be removed immediately. The officer asked her if she had any proof that the land was under HOA control. She didn't. Instead, she pointed to a dog-eared copy of the HOA handbook she had pulled from her tote bag. The officer looked it over briefly, flipping to the section she referenced. It contained vague language about communal areas, but nothing specific. He asked if she had a map of the association boundaries or if any survey had been conducted. She stammered, said it was common knowledge and everyone knows that's ours. At that moment, I retrieved my folder from inside. It contained everything I had prepared: the original property deed, surveyor's certified maps, zoning diagrams, and a letter from my real estate attorney. The officer reviewed each item carefully, holding the documents up against the light, comparing the property lines to a map he pulled up on his phone. The boundary lines were unmistakable. The land in question wasn't just adjacent to mine, it was part of it. The area Karen had accused me of invading had been privately owned for years, and the HOA had never had any claim to it. Karen's tone shifted as she realized what was happening. Her arms dropped. Her voice, once aggressive and commanding, now sounded unsure. She tried to redirect the focus, saying that even if the land was technically mine, I was still visually disrupting the community's aesthetic. The officer cut her off gently, but firmly, explaining that personal taste wasn't a legal matter and that HOA guidelines didn't apply to land outside their jurisdiction. He even pointed out that calling 911 for a non-emergency issue involving private property could be considered an abuse of emergency services. Karen began to fidget, adjusting her sunglasses, trying to reclaim her composure. She asked if a formal warning could be issued anyway, saying it would help set a precedent. The officer shook his head. There was no legal violation, nothing to warn me about. He turned back to me, thanked me for cooperating, and said there was no further issue. As he returned my documents, he commented that it was one of the most thorough property packages he'd ever seen a homeowner present on the spot. The crowd of neighbors, now slightly larger, had clearly heard most of the exchange. Some of them chuckled quietly. One even gave me a subtle thumbs up. Karen stood frozen, embarrassed but unwilling to walk away. The illusion of her authority had cracked. For months, she had operated as if she had the final word on everything, but the police had just demonstrated otherwise. No citation, no warning, not even a suggestion that I change what I was doing. Just a calm confirmation that I was well within my rights. After the officers left, I continued working. Karen didn't say another word that day. She lingered awkwardly near the sidewalk for a few minutes, then stormed off in the opposite direction. The neighborhood had witnessed something important, something that would ripple beyond just that afternoon. Karen's unchecked power had finally met a boundary she couldn't cross, and the badge she thought would back her up had, instead, sided with the facts. The days following the incident with the police were strangely quiet. Karen, who usually flooded inboxes with HOA updates and reminders about rules and regulations, didn't send a single email. Her usual patrols through the neighborhood slowed down, and for once, I didn't catch her pacing the sidewalks with that signature clipboard. It was as if she'd been stunned into silence. But that calm didn't mean nothing was happening. Behind the scenes, the HOA was starting to come apart at the seams. The confrontation had sparked more than just embarrassment. It had triggered questions, investigations, and eventually, consequences that no one on the board saw coming. Neighbors who had silently accepted Karen's rule started to talk. Some even came by to thank me for standing up to her. One older couple down the road said they'd been harassed over the color of their shutters and were too afraid to speak up. Another neighbor mentioned how he'd been fined for a lawnmower left out for too long. People were sharing stories, comparing letters, and realizing that what they thought were isolated incidents were part of a much broader pattern. Karen hadn't just been enforcing rules, she'd been weaponizing them. A group of residents decided to organize a petition, not against the HOA itself, but for a complete audit of its practices and boundaries. They wanted transparency. They wanted maps, records, minutes from meetings, and clarity about what authority the board actually had. Most importantly, they wanted Karen held accountable for overstepping. The petition spread fast. Within a week, over 70% of homeowners had signed it. That was enough to trigger a special meeting, and this time, Karen couldn't delay it or shut it down with technicalities. When a meeting was finally held in the community center, it was standing room only. The air was thick with tension and long-held frustration. Karen sat at the front of the room, trying to maintain her usual stern expression, but it was clear she was rattled. The board chair opened the floor for discussion, and one by one, people stepped up to speak. They recounted stories of unjust fines, ignored maintenance requests, one-sided decisions, and a general atmosphere of fear and favoritism. My incident with the police came up again and again, cited as the clearest example of Karen abusing her position. Then came the request for documentation. One resident asked for proof of the HOA's authority over certain areas Karen had repeatedly tried to control. Another asked for financial transparency, where the fines were going, how the dues were being spent. That's when things started to unravel. The board couldn't produce updated boundary maps. Their last full property survey was nearly a decade old. Worse, some of the areas Karen claimed were HOA jurisdiction, like the parcel I owned, were clearly not listed anywhere in their recorded documents. When asked why the board had issued warnings and citations over land they didn't control, Karen shifted uncomfortably and said it was based on understanding and common practice. That wasn't good enough anymore. The homeowners wanted facts, legal documents, clear lines of authority. And when those weren't available, the mood turned. A motion was made to suspend Karen from her duties, pending a full legal review. Another motion called for dissolving the current board and holding new elections. The vote was almost unanimous. Karen sat in disbelief as her power was stripped away in a matter of minutes. The authority she had clung to for years crumbling beneath her like a house of cards. News of the board's collapse spread quickly. Some residents celebrated openly, while others simply felt relieved that the intimidation had ended. I stayed quiet, watching it all unfold, knowing that my part had been small but important. The truth was, Karen hadn't just overreached once. She'd built an entire system around her assumptions and ego. When that foundation was tested, it couldn't hold. The HOA wasn't abolished entirely, but it was restructured from the ground up. A new board was elected, one that promised transparency, fairness, and actual community engagement. They brought in legal experts to help redraw property boundaries and made all future meetings public and recorded. Citations now had to be backed by evidence and reviewed before being issued. The atmosphere shifted from fear to collaboration. People started attending meetings not out of dread, but out of interest. Karen moved out a few months later. Her house sat on the market longer than most in the neighborhood, and though no one said it out loud, everyone knew why. The very rules she had used to control others had, in the end, boxed her in. The power she had misused had been taken away, not by rebellion or conflict, but by truth, facts, and a neighborhood that finally stood up for itself. The entire ordeal became more than just a personal victory. It evolved into a case study in what happens when entitlement, unchecked authority, and ignorance collide with facts, ownership, and patience. Karen didn't start out as someone with malicious intent, or at least that's what I'd like to believe. But somewhere along the way, she began to believe that her seat on the HOA board made her the ultimate decision-maker in the neighborhood. Her title, her clipboard, her routine patrols. These weren't just tasks, they were badges of imagined superiority. She assumed that because most people didn't challenge her, she was always right. And that assumption turned into a kind of obsession. The rules she once interpreted to maintain order started being used as tools to bend people to her will. They became weapons. People stopped decorating their front yards creatively, fearing fines. Neighbors who once hosted small cookouts now second-guessed whether they'd get a complaint about unapproved gatherings. She blurred the line between community standards and personal vendettas. And each time someone gave in quietly, it reinforced her belief that she was untouchable. Until the day she picked the wrong target, someone who not only knew the law, but owned the very ground she was trying to govern. What Karen failed to understand was how fragile her power actually was. HOA rules are only as strong as the laws that back them. You can't govern land you don't own or have legal jurisdiction over. She had built her influence on assumption, intimidation, and routine compliance. But all it took was one incident to bring that illusion crashing down. The moment I showed the officers the deed, the maps, and the legal proof of ownership, the structure she operated within began to collapse. Not because I shouted or threatened, but because truth doesn't need volume. It only needs clarity. That was the real lesson. You don't need to raise your voice when you're standing on solid ground. Entitlement may be loud, may call the cops, may flash rules in your face, but it can't override legal ownership. Facts, once laid bare, cut through ego like a knife. And the irony was that while Karen thought she was protecting the community from rule breakers, she had become the very disruptor she claimed to fight against. The trust people had in the HOA, in the idea of community management, had been eroded by her heavy hand and biased enforcement. People began to reflect. They realized how easy it had been to let one person dominate simply because she was willing to speak the loudest. It exposed a deeper issue, not just with Karen, but with how so many communities allow small boards to operate unchecked. Without transparency, without regular oversight, without accountability, even the smallest bit of power can be distorted. It reminded everyone that authority without restraint isn't leadership, it's control. I wasn't the only one who learned something from that experience. Neighbors who once shrugged off Karen's behavior started asking questions about their own rights, reading HOA bylaws, attending meetings. They began to see that participation mattered. That silence enables abuse. That you don't need to fight fire with fire. Sometimes a calm response with facts is all it takes to shift the tide. And the shift wasn't just procedural, it was cultural. The neighborhood changed. People started engaging again, not out of fear, but out of genuine interest in keeping their community fair and balanced. Karen, for all her faults, served as a warning of what happens when enforcement becomes personal. Her fall wasn't just about property lines or police calls. It was about accountability, about facing the consequences of overstepping boundaries, literally and figuratively. She didn't just lose her position. She lost credibility, trust, and the power she once wielded so carelessly. And she did it to herself, blinded by the belief that being on the board made her immune to rules she imposed on others. In the end, what stood was not just a plot of land defended, but a principle that even in the face of aggressive control, quiet confidence and preparedness can bring balance back. That community isn't built by policing every inch of someone's lawn. It's built by respecting where one person's rights end and another's begin. And maybe most importantly, that no title, no handbook, and no clipboard grants someone the right to override the truth.